Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Agronomy Highlights podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Spelman, and as always, I'm joined here with my co host and colleague, Justin Brackenrich. Justin, how are you doing today?
We're doing good today, Ryan. How about yourself?
Justin, I'm living the dream once again. It's starting to get real cold out, and again, we're going to start talking about the weather because we actually have a related topic today. But yeah, it's starting to get real cold at nights. Things are wrapping up in the field. We've actually had a really kind of dry harvest season, which in some ways has been really good because we've been able to get a lot of cropland harvested. And yeah, that's kind of what's going on here. What's going on in your neck of the woods?
Kind of a similar situation. I think a lot of folks that I work with are done harvest. We had a great window to get that done, probably better than usual. But now we're kind of actually setting into a bit of a wet period. This morning on the news, I heard the first forecast for snow potential looking for Thursday and Friday. So, it we keep talking about getting cold, but here it is almost Thanksgiving, right? We're due for cold. We've kicked this can down the road as long as we can. So I think it's time, and I think we're overdue. But like you said, this is a pretty timely talk that we're going to do today, speaking about weather and moisture and cold. Today, we're going to talk about manure. And that's kind of an interesting topic. Ryan and I deal with this some in livestock production and the things that we do, but we don't really get into the regulation side of it and the DEP and what you can and can't do. And so this do's and don'ts is going to be really interesting. I'm looking forward to learning more about this, Ryan.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think you're right. The regulations surrounding manure to me, it's like a black box, right? I know what's going on out there. I know, especially this time of year, once we do see folks wrapping up harvests, they're looking for something to do. And in my area, in Martinsburg, we're a heavy dairy area, right? So that means there's a lot of manure to work with. So the second folks aren't doing something else in their field, I go to the office and I'm smelling manure everywhere. You see the manure trucks going by, and 'tis the season. It feels like, and I don't know if that's a good thing or not. So today we're gonna learn a little bit more about that. So yeah, I kind of in looking into this. Usually, me and Justin, we're trying to gather some information about Pennsylvania to figure out how relevant this is. And there's not a lot out there on manure production, right? It's not something that a lot of people keep track of, at least that I'm aware of in public information. So what I did is I found some data in the ag census. And so this was the latest ag census was in 2022, but a little snapshot of basically how much livestock we have in Pennsylvania compared to cropland. We have about in the state of Pennsylvania, we have 1.3 million cattle, and that's including calves. So cattle calves, that includes dairy and beef. We have 84 million poultry, and that's chicken and turkeys. And that surprised me because I don't know about you, Justin, but in my area, we don't have a lot of poultry. And I'd imagine that's kind of in the southeast part of the state. So there you go, 1.3 million cattle, 84 million poultry, and 1.3 million hogs and pigs. So we have basically the same amount of hogs and pigs in Pennsylvania as cattle, which also surprised me. So those are the numbers. It's kind of meaningless without applying some other things to it. So when I tallied up the amount of acres in cropland in Pennsylvania, I found that we had 3.7 million acres in cropland and 1.4 million acres in forage. So that's about 5 million acres in cropland and forage production in Pennsylvania. So what that means is for every 4 acres of cropland in Pennsylvania, that means there's one cow, or sorry, one cattle, whether it's a cow or a calf, 16 and a half poultry, so 16 and a half chickens or turkey, and one pig, pig or hog. So that's kind of what the breakdown. So there's a lot of manure. If we spread it out on every piece of cropland, I think we could use more, but when you actually think of it, that's a lot of manure, right, to manage and to apply.
That kind
So
of
what do you
sounds
think,
like you're
Justin?
starting your like little house on the prairie farm with one cow, one pig, 16 chickens and turkeys, right? Um, and one of the things that I grew up in the Eastern Panhandle of West Virginia where poultry was very prevalent too, right? And we saw this that a lot of our lesser manures like sheep or when I was younger, swine was still fairly well kept on farms, right? We don't see as many backyard swine flocks or swine
Hmm.
herds as what we used to. Um, but like those things were kind of treated like a disposal rate because it was much easier to go get chicken manure, right? It was
Right.
easier to handle, it was lighter, it didn't have as much moisture in it. You were kind of treating these fields with a ton and a half all the time. But I actually ran some numbers on this, and one of the things that we're trying to do is talk more about the economics of some of these things. And if we consider the value of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and we use some of these book values of manure, we're looking at about $18 a ton in beef manure and a fertilizer value, right? Like, I mean, that may not seem like a lot, but if we're wintering our beef cows, we've got some hay in there, we've got some stacking and storage, that can be fairly significant, especially if we're putting it out there, right? And so water weight kind of contributes to some of that. So we'll not get into it too far. But when we think about something all the way up into chicken, based on these values, there can be a fertilizer value of about $90 a ton. And so really high value that we should be considering not just putting it out there willy-nilly, not putting it out on these steeper slopes when they're wet to run off, really making sure we're getting the best nutrients and bang for our buck out of this stuff. So that's what we have these experts for today to talk to us about how we can really get into this, how we can treat this manure like a resource and not just this byproduct of having animals, and what we're allowed to do with it during the winter to best utilize it and to keep us in compliance. So I think we're ready to get started. Ryan, what do you think?
I think we're ready to get started. Absolutely. I think they're done listening to us. Justin, why don't you go ahead and introduce our
Sure.
guest?
So let's get our first speaker. Our first speaker is going to be Dr. Robb Meinen. He is a Penn State Extension specialist and focus on nutrients and manure management. Robb, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. I'm Robb Meinen. I am also, besides the state extension specialist for manure and nutrient management, I am the director of the Pennsylvania uh, Nutrient Management Education Program. That's housed here at Penn State. We contract with the state, a state conservation commission, and also somewhat with the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture and the Department of Environmental Protection in the state to help deliver programs that protect water quality from the nutrients in manure, which are of concern. Nitrogen and phosphorus, if they get in the water, they don't do us any good over there. But if we keep them in the field, that's where we can get the bang for the buck, right? You just mentioned the value of manure being from 18 to up to $90 for a ton of manure in the poultry world. That's valuable stuff. Let's keep it for ourselves and put it to the good use in our crops and get it to the root instead of beyond the edge of field.
Great. Our other speaker is Leanna Duppstadt. Leanna has been with us in the past, usually talking about forages, but today we're going to see the other side of her life, which is manure and nutrient management. Leanna, you want to introduce yourself again?
Yeah, so hi everyone. Name's Leanna Duppstadt. I'm an agronomy educator based out of Bedford County, Pennsylvania. And like Justin said, yeah, I usually work a lot with forages, but I'm also a leader of the nutrient management sub-team here with our extension group. And I work a lot with livestock producers, obviously, with having forages and that sort of thing. So getting to work with the manure a lot, especially a lot of those folks who have confinement areas for their livestock. So yeah.
Yeah, so we have a fully Penn State episode for you guys today. We're gonna represent PA here. So I guess we want to start here with this idea of a manure management plan. Okay, so we had a program with Leanna and Robb actually in Huntington in one of the areas that I cover, and it was specifically we talked about manure management, how to follow a plan. Can one of you guys introduce what a manure management plan is, why it's relevant to Pennsylvania farmers?
Yeah, so I can start with that. So a manure management plan is it's basically a tool to manage manure from livestock, and we want to maximize the benefits of the manure, but we also want to make sure we're minimizing its environmental impact. So we're crunching some numbers essentially and seeing how much manure we're producing, how much acres we have to put on, and to make sure we're managing that appropriately and keeping records of it from year to year. and updating that as we need to update it whenever more or less livestock move onto the property, that sort of thing.
Now, Leanna, is the manure management plan something, is it a regulation, like something they have to follow? And who's the one responsible for making sure someone follows these regulations, right?
Yeah, so anybody who has property or a facility or is a farming operation that has livestock or handles manure is someone that needs to have one of these, and it is regulated through Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. So you can write up a manure management plan or you have a nutrient management plan, and this all depends on how many livestock you have. Rob, do some more on the regulation side of that because there's some things that I won't say correctly.
Okay. I would add that if uh, anybody who utilizes manure or generates manure should have a plan, right, by the rule of the land. And that plan can come in different forms. Some of our largest farms fall into federal or state definitions that require them to have a nutrient management plan. But I think most of the people that are listening to this podcast that aren't familiar with the plan that they need would probably fall into that manure management plan aspect. That's handled by DEP in our state. There are a couple different forms there. One is for the smallest producer, if you will. That might be someone who just has a couple pigs at home for 4-H or something. They still need to have a plan, and there's what's called a short form that they can complete. DEP has that on their website, and then if you go and look at the short form and you have a little more animals that were manure than that, then you should go ahead and complete the full-blown manure management plan.
Yeah, so that was an update that they did just this year, right, Rob?
That's right. That came out in April of 2024. So it's kind of hot off the press, if you will, and new to a lot of people with that short form. So they kind of pulled back on some of the requirements for everybody that would fall into that real small animal number category.
Yeah, that's really nice. Something nice that they did, especially for people in my area. You've got farms from all different sizes. Anybody who just has backyard poultry to up to those guys that have the large dairies. But what was really nice about that short form is it's anything with less than 8,000 pounds combined weight. So that really gives you a lot of flexibility to have a horse or two in the backyard plus some chickens, or you're raising your own hog for meat or something like that. So it gave folks a lot more flexibility rather than having to do that whole manure management plan with a checklist and a bunch of different sections, and just
So
it was
we'll
a
get
nice
the link
addition that they did.
to the DEP website and the meeting notes, and kind of that first link there, they call it the DEP's Manure Management Manual. And if you go through this PDF, right, it's kind of got an example of each one of them. It's got the blank documents you need, but before you get into each section, they talk about this short form. It kind of says, is this right for you? And what are the check boxes you would have to make that your plan, right? And if you don't fit that, then you can kind of bypass all of those and go to this manure management plan, like to this bigger one, and see if those fit what you're looking for, right? So it's a pretty good document, and we'll make sure that that gets in there. If anyone wants to kind of double check this or go back and see what fits their operation, the link will be in the show notes.
Perfect.
Yeah, so they made it a pretty simple yes/no checklist for the most part, and as long as you're answering yes or not applicable, you get to go ahead and use that short version.
Yeah, and it's a good spot no matter what version you need as you go through that process. The best place to go find it is the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection Clean Water Academy. That Clean Water Academy website is something that anybody can search on their search engine on their phone or computer and get to pretty easily. But I would note that everybody can complete their own manure management plan, right? This is not a plan that you need to have a professional hired to do. So the plans are not that complicated, and they do have really nice instructions there. They actually have a course that you can go through and put yourself through at your own pace if you are really interested in self-guiding and seeing some videos and things that will give you some really good instruction on how to complete this.
I'm always a fan of somebody giving me sample calculations so I can kind of walk through the numbers before I do it. So they give really nice step-by-step instructions, that's for sure.
So it sounds to me like the manure management plan, it sounds, I think anytime you put in a management plan, it can sound intimidating and like something that a farmer might want to run away from, right? But from what you guys are kind of telling me about this, it seems like it's pretty simple to do. There are options for folks that have smaller operations. That short form sounds like a good option, and it's really great practice to understand your operation and also not lose some of your money in manure that you have on the farm. So I think I kind of want to take us on a quick tangent here, just because I think we covered a lot about what this manure management plan is, how we use it, but I don't know if we really covered the why, right? So we've kind of talked a little bit about the value of manure and in your operation, and talked a little bit about the environmental impacts if you don't manage it properly. Maybe Rob, could you talk a little bit more about what manure can do to the environment if it is not managed properly and why it's really important that we are thoughtful about it from that perspective?
Sure, right? Whenever we couple crops and animal manure, right, and we have that all through our state with all types of species, we have some challenges, right? We need to feed protein and energy in the front end to the animal to get them to grow and to be productive. To do that, we're feeding nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium, right? Those are our three macronutrients for our crops. And if we're growing crops, we appreciate the value of that. If we're buying fertilizer, we appreciate the value of that. So whenever we have manure and the nitrogen or phosphorus are in that manure, we want to direct that to the crop and keep it out of the water, because nitrogen in the water, phosphorus in the water lead to eutrophication, you lead to degradation of the water quality. And we all want to get the agronomic and economic value of that nitrogen, of that phosphorus, and avoid that environmental risk and the negative aspect that can come with that, right? So we want to keep it applied in the field, and we can think of it as manure application, but sometimes we might think of the term as actually manure nutrient placement, right? If you're going to place fertilizer with your corn seed, you're going to be precise in how you put that fertilizer in the field. Well, let's be precise with our manure as well, right? Nutrient placement, and keep the nutrient in the field at the place that we want it, where we want it, until it can be utilized and be assimilated in the crop. If that manure, nitrogen, or phosphorus go beyond the edge of field or go below the root zone, then we've lost it, right? We've lost that agronomic and economic value, and then it becomes an environmental liability.
I feel like I get a lot from farmers that they're not that they want to be wasteful with it, but they don't think about the fact that it has all of this value. They're not actively paying for it like they would for commercial fertilizer. So I feel like they're not always thinking about it with dollar signs in mind, essentially. So like looking at it from the environmental side of things, of course, like we would with our commercial fertilizers, but then like the fact that you're able to save this money essentially with this manure you already have. So like why not utilize it and capitalize on it like the best way possible? We want to maximize that, save money where we can.
And let's not forget, in the world of that a lot of us are in, where we're trying to propagate soil health, right? We appreciate how much adding that carbon to the soil can help us, right? It gives our soils resiliency in times of extreme weather, and allows us to actually have those nutrients held, right? And mobilize the nutrients and hold them. And manure brings that, right? Manure brings that addition of carbon to the soil.
Certainly, yeah. In a world where we're seeing people move towards a lot of precision equipment, right? Why not view this like that, right? Everyone's looking at being as precise as they can with their equipment, investing so much money in that equipment. Why is this any different, right? Why? And then when it comes to manure, all right, we'll just get rid of it, right? No, we'll use this precisely. I think that's a really good point. So okay, I think we've pretty much covered most of this manure management plan idea, some of the concepts behind that, and what that means. And we are also going to put a link in the show notes of the kind of an overview of the manure management plan that I think you guys wrote on our website as well. Now, kind of the topic of today, as we're moving into the winter, right? There are some added complications of spreading manure once we have frozen ground, we have wintertime temperatures. So let's talk about that. So first of all, can you guys? We hear this word winter manure spreading. Can you guys simply define that? What's winter manure spreading, and what is winter when we're talking about it in Pennsylvania?
No problem. We discussed that quite a bit, right? Because winter is a time of higher risk. Our crops aren't growing, and we have dormant soils and dormant uptake of nutrients. So we are reasonable to have a little bit more conservative approach to manure application. So that because we want to place that nutrient in a way in which it'll stay until springtime when things start to green up and we can use the nutrient for crop growth. So the winter definition in the state of Pennsylvania is the same across all of our manure and nutrient programs, and it starts officially on the calendar on December 15th and runs through to February 28th. So we have that 2.5 month period where we have the state defined winter on the calendar, but we know that between New York line and the Mason-Dixon line that we have variation in our weather, right? And one size does not fit all. So then there's two other items that come into play. If you have those calendar dates, it's winter, or if your ground is frozen to a depth of 4 inches or more, it's considered winter. So it could be December 14th and you have frozen ground, or it could be April 1 and you have frozen ground. It's considered a winter field condition. The other third one, besides the calendar and the frozen ground, is if you have snow. So snow cover of any type requires winter considerations for manure application. Whenever that law came out in 2006, that the revamping of this winter definition, I asked one of the people in Harrisburg that helped to formulate the rule, and I thought, wow, I have to talk to people about this, and I have to make sure I can easily define and explain to people what is snow cover. And he said to me, if I'm standing at the edge of the field with you and I point out there and I say, what's that white stuff? And if you say it's snow, then I'm going to say, as a regulator, that it's snow cover. And it's that simple to understand, right? So it could be a dusting or it could be 10 inches of snow. And we're going to consider that in the state snow. And that could be before December 15th or after February 28th.
So at this point, maybe by the end of the week, it could be winter, according to these.
So the one that kind of gets me is this: anytime the soil is frozen 4 inches or deeper, right? So part of it, we would think maybe counterintuitive or something. The farmers I work with say, well, it's frozen. Now's a perfect time for me to get out there on the field because I'm not rutting it up. What's the negative of having this frozen soil? Why isn't that a good time to go out there and do it?
It's just indicative of a time where risk is higher, right? If you have frozen soil, then we know that it is a winter type condition, and you don't know exactly what happened to the soil beforehand. Was that soil dry? Like here we are at the end of November 2024, and we have drought conditions in much of our state. If the soil was frozen now, it would still allow some infiltration. However, if it had rained a lot up until that time that frozen situation occurred and the soil was already saturated as it froze, now infiltration into the soil is pretty tough. So if you put manure on the surface and the surface starts to melt before the frozen soil beneath, the risk of runoff across and transportation of nitrogen, phosphorus, and manure constituents across the surface is increased. So conditions are going to vary from place to place and time to time, but you kind of have to have a rule with a one size fits all, and that's how that boiled down.
Yeah, and it is a good time because you can get out, the ground is nice and hard, you're not going to cause all those compaction issues and everything, which is what the farmers are typically thinking of. But you do have to think about the fact that you're kind of throwing it onto a frozen field. So there's not a lot of movement of that into the soil at all. It's just kind of laying there. And if we get any sort of weather event, it's Pennsylvania, you could get anything. Your ground could be frozen and then we get a wet rain. That just washed all of that right off of there without any infiltration at all. So you gotta kind of keep those things in mind.
If it washes off, there goes your agronomic benefit, your economic benefit, and your environmental risk just went through the roof, right?
Yep, absolutely.
So I'm gonna throw this out to you all because we're titling this and kind of following off an article, the do's and don'ts of wintertime manure. Do we want to start with the do's or the don'ts?
I mean, either one. They kind of coincide where you go back and
I-
forth. Let's do this, but let's not do this.
Okay. Okay, so we'll just
I think
start out.
I think I think one of the first do's and don'ts is to just to quantify that winter application is legal in Pennsylvania, right? We can apply in those dates when the ground is frozen or if we have snow covered. But we can all appreciate that because soils are dormant, crops are dormant, or the risk of runoff is higher, that we might want to take a better approach. And the state is saying you can apply, but you just have to be more conservative in how you approach that.
And there are clearly defined guidelines, right? When we say like take a more conservative approach, this is not like, well, I'll do a third of what I usually do, right? Like this is not up for interpretation of how that works. And we'll put this article in here of do's and don'ts. But again, these are clearly defined lowering limits, right? And just to throw one out here, winter application rates less than or equal to 5,000 gallons of liquid manure, right? Like, so they are defined. These things have to be kind of put in your balance sheet as part of your manure management plan, and tracked. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct, right?
Okay.
So a lower application rate is going to help you minimize risk. One way, one do is to try to apply manure before winter, right? If we can apply manure before those winter conditions, then we have the opportunity for it to be infiltrated, those nutrients infiltrated into the soil and have them stored for next year. You also minimize risk of overflowing your manure storage or running out of capacity because you don't know what will the weather be like in March or April and how much window of opportunity do you have to get to the field with your manure. So kind of safeguarding yourself and getting manure out in the fall is always a good plan.
Yeah, I feel like I get that conversation from a lot of folks who live in large rural communities, and farmers are out there spreading manure at times of year where they're like, what are they doing? And I'm like, well, eventually the manure storage is full and you run all these other risks of like breaking down your manure storage because an overflowing, like you said. And so there are times when you have to get out there and put it somewhere. And so having this nice do's and don'ts list of like, if I have to do this, where am I allowed to do this? Where am I gonna do this the most effectively and safely, essentially?
I'll tell you what, I managed a large sow farm for a while, and one year the weather was terrible in the spring. We just could not get work done, and the manure storage got higher and higher. And I went above freeboard, and that was in the years that I managed animals. That was one of the most stressful things for me because I kept watching that every day and wondering when am I going to get my opportunity. And then I kept thinking back to October and thinking, boy, I wish I'd have had it all the way down back then.
Yeah, I mean, we can't forget that other side of this picture, right? That it needs to go somewhere, and sometimes that's not at the ideal time, right? So if we can follow some of this and keep it in mind, we can maybe make better decisions on maybe where those fields are, right? That we are spreading if it is an inclement time of the winter. So maybe you guys could talk about that. What would maybe a good field to maybe spread in an unideal situation be?
Well, and I want to backtrack on that a little bit. If you find yourself spreading manure in the winter more and more often, it may be one of those times where you start to think, I might need to increase my manure storage so that I don't have to apply quite so much in the winter. I can hold on to it until spring when it's going to be utilized better and be more environmentally safe. So that's something that I would think about too.
Very good point, Leanna. And right now, there's funding available. So talk to your county districts, your conservation districts, and say, hey, I would like more manure storage. Is there opportunity for me to have some funding go into this? So you might not have to foot the whole bill because the agency world appreciates that if you increase your storage, you're going to get better agronomic and economic value and minimize risk in times like this.
Mm-hmm.
Sure, and that's through the ACAP funds available right now, correct? Or are there other funding?
There are
depending on
loads of
county?
other funds available through conservation district programs, NRCS programs, things like that. So there's numerous programs to help pay for those.
That's a really good point. Yeah, if you can increase your storage, that's gonna protect you against a lot of this, right? And then you can really make the decision based on what's good for the fields, not just I need to, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. And your question earlier, Ryan, one of the first steps you have to do in thinking about where to take the manure in the wintertime is that you have to pre-plan, right? The manure management plan is kind of getting you to think about that so that you have your plans listed ahead of time of where will you go with that manure if you want to apply in the wintertime. So when you apply in the winter, legally that field should be in the plan and designated for winter application, and you should have thought through these processes, and those would include some of the other safeguards that are built into the planning process, right? Going on slopes that are shallow, you have to have ground cover that's more than 25% crop residue or an established cover crop in those scenarios. So we want to make sure that something is on the soil and we don't have bare soil, so something's there to hold it. And the slopes cannot be more than 15% steep. So you have to think, well, I'm going to go to a shallower slope, flatter field. And my steepest fields and one of my steepest portions of fields are probably off limits for winter application.
Yeah, it may seem pretty self-explanatory, but you got to think about those nice sod areas, anywhere where you just have grass everywhere. Safest bet. Grass and like 0 to 5% slope. Perfect. But I mean, realistically, I live in Western Pennsylvania. I've got slopes on my farm that are 20% slope. So those definitely not in the cards for any sort of winter manure application, that's for sure. Not that I would want to be driving on them anyway if they had snow or frozen ground. So, I mean, there's that. But yeah, just thinking like, okay, I want those places where there's this perennial grass in it because it's going to be able to take up those nutrients the best. And then just downstepping from there, well, this spot has a cover crop on it. It's growing, and that would be a good place to put it. And then moving down to those places that just have that 25% residue cover. And so that can eliminate any of your corn grain that maybe you picked up fodder off of that wouldn't have enough cover. Any low yielding soybeans would not be an ideal location. So just keeping those things in mind.
You start to
can't help
mention, go ahead, Justin.
I can't help but to talk about forage, right? Any opportunity I get. Uh, Winter manure is also, right, and you all are the experts, so correct me if I'm wrong, but we have an excellent opportunity to get manure on things that we would use as animal feeds because we can reduce some of that foodborne E. coli, salmonella type risk that we would see getting picked up if we were trying to do these in the spring, because we do want to see that time of degradation between, we don't want to put out manure in April and cut it for hay in May, right? That's a no-go for us on a lot of cases. And then the other place that I really see a lot of good opportunity for this, Leanna just mentioned the use of like kind of stepping through this hierarchy, but one that I like to recommend are focusing on perennial fields that are transitioning into row crops, right? Like if you've got an alfalfa or a perennial stand that next year is at the end of the road and you're going to be putting that into corn or beans, you've got good cover, it's going into a row crop because we've been pulling a lot of nutrients out of this as hay and probably not fertilizing it well. Typically, those could handle that a little better than some others. And because we're going to row crops, maybe they're going to be a little more shallow in their slope department. So, maybe I'm giving bad advice. What do you guys think about that? Is that okay?
I don't know what you're talking about. I think everybody's going out there and fertilizing their hay fields after every single cutting and catching up on everything
right.
right?
Right. Yeah, that's right. Uh-huh. Potash all the time. Yep.
Soil
yeah,
tests
no.
every 3 years. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's sound advice. I think that would work really well. Yeah.
Yeah, and you're getting into the world of rotations, right? And thinking about rotations and strategically placing it. And if we're thinking winter application, prioritizing and saying, where are my best target fields? And sometimes that might not be by location, right? You say, oh, that's a flat field and it's far away from the stream. That should be a priority. But within a rotation, sometimes fields are better. So what's really nice is the agencies have allowed these manure management plans to be, once written, active for multiple years as long as the rotation stays the same. So field 1 might be that field that's rotating out of the hay this year. Next year it might be field 2. So in 2025 versus 2026, 6, you could still have the same manure management plan apply to that spot in the rotation. So that's really nice. You know, believe it or not, the agencies work with and listen closely to our farming community and want to make sure that what they do is reasonable, right, and allows us all to move forward.
Yeah, they're not trying to make it difficult. And when I talk about manure management plans and people are like, I don't know about filling them out. It's one of those things where I'm like, you do this every day, every week, all year, like, and you don't change it that much. Honestly, you're basically just writing down what you already do and getting it down on paper. And it's that simple.
So I think we've covered a lot of these, but one that I think is maybe most confusing or most frustrating, because we see this in a lot of different areas that we work in, are these setbacks.
Mhm.
Right? We see this complaint. I don't know if it's a complaint, maybe confusion, complaint, irritant, whatever you want to lump this as.
Depends on where it's coming from.
Yeah, we see it in fertilizer, we see it in herbicides, any kind of pesticide application, and now we see it in manure. What is the difference in setbacks in wintertime versus summertime? And talk to us a little bit about how those kind of pertain to this.
Well, in the wintertime, you often have a setback that starts at 100 feet if you're applying manure at home from water sources of concern, which are streams, lakes, ponds, sinkholes, and wells. You can get into, as you write your plan, the specifics and look at your field and figure out based on slopes and ground cover, et cetera, what your setbacks are. But in wintertime, you're going to see those setbacks increase. And that's reasonable because the risk is different in the wintertime and we have a higher risk of runoff. So the state says, hey, let's keep the manure application back there a little bit. We're going to allow you to do it in the wintertime. You apply manure, but let's be a little more conservative on that setback.
So a lot of times those setbacks, like if you have, for example, if you have outside of winter, if you have a buffer or something like a vegetated buffer between yourself and a stream and it's permanent, it's there all the time, we drop that down to 35 feet. But in the wintertime, no matter what, you are keeping that at 100 feet all the time.
And just for, those that might not have heard the word setback, does that mean no manure ever applied within that area during that time of year? Or is it limited, right?
So setbacks and buffers are basically that space that you have between an environmental area. So a lot of times streams, ponds, things like that, wellheads. And so whenever you put up a buffer, you're starting from stream bank, for example, and going out that 35 feet, 100 feet, something like that. A lot of times those do end up, they're permanent. And so there may not be an actual fence there, but it is this line, this delineation of I don't do any sort of farming fertilizer application in this space right here to make sure that I'm not allowing nutrients, because you don't want to overwhelm. The whole point in that buffer is that it's catching any nutrients that might be running towards that body of water. And so if you start applying nutrients to the buffer, you're overwhelming it with too many nutrients. It can't capture anything. It's just going to start getting lost. And so you don't want to do anything nutrient related to that space.
And quickly, I did the math. If we're thinking about corn, that's about 14 rows, right? And, anymore, like we're losing a bunch of outside rows anyway. And we're talking about like if it's a well or a creek, like that's from bank fill. Is that from the edge of the creek? But we're not actually farming up against that anyway in most cases, right? And so when we have this concept of 35 or even 100 feet, it's not really as far as what it sounds like when we're telling you we're talking about it right now. 35 to 100 feet, and your yield loss or things probably aren't as dramatic as what we really think they are, because we're not really heavily manuring or fertilizing those outside edges anyway, because a lot of the cases where I'm at, we've got trees out there anyway, we've got deer and raccoons and everything that cruise that. And so a lot of times people get really worked up and scared about this buffer, but think of it in a context. What are we actually losing that we're actually gaining from better environmental stewardship, better manure, better nutrient placement, and our ability to kind of manage what we're looking at? So I have a manure do, and maybe Ryan's got one, or
A
maybe
do.
yeah. One of my things is I see a lot of folks where I'm at that are doing like daily scraping hauls or they're doing them every few days. One of the things that I see so much, and I can almost pick it out in a soil test now, is the field by the barn, right? And um, I really strongly encourage people that if you have a nice day, take it somewhere else, right? Like I know that we don't always have the best weather or our roads aren't always the best. But we know those really wet days or something like that, we may have to put it out close to the field, to the barn. But I really encourage them when the sun's shining and the roads are good, please try to take that somewhere else, right? I know this is part of this plan, and I know that you have to do this. But if we're not always doing that to meet our plan, think of it as a nutrient distribution, right? Think of it as trying to get that out there for that next best crop.
Great. Another point with that is if you study the plant response curve to nitrogen or phosphorus addition, right? The initial units that you put on are going to get you more response per pound of nitrogen, per pound of phosphorus in your crop response than ones that are put on later. So putting that nutrient across more acres at a lower rate can be viewed as being more economic. Now I know you got to travel further, etc., and there's fuel involved in that and whatever, but it is something to think about with that lower rate on more acres. It can be beneficial.
Sure, and to add that to that, right? You mentioned that response curve, and you do get diminishing returns once you go past a point of adequate nutrition. But also, when we're talking about some manures, they can be kind of high in phosphorus, and too much phosphorus in your system can put you in a place where now you're managing your nutrients applications to reduce the amount of phosphorus over time, right? So that's another thing to keep in mind. Is that something that you see often on Pennsylvania farms and in certain like dairy farms or something like that, or is that something that's not a big issue?
I think people that manage a lot of manure have become pretty savvy to that, right? So they're paying close attention to their soil test phosphorus and paying attention to where they distribute the manure and how they go about that so that they're managing to not build their soil tests up to the point where they have to have phosphorus restriction uh, on their manure application. So I think people are very wise to that. And if you think about the soil test and the manure analysis, right, those can come out to be about $50. You know, if you get your soil and your manure analyzed, and that's pretty good money spent, right? If you think about how much pounds of nitrogen or phosphorus $50 can buy you, it doesn't get you very far. But if you can analyze your soil, analyze your manure, and then put those values into the manure management plan, there's a nice tool called Nutrient Balance Sheet that anybody can develop within that Clean Water Academy system. And you can get at home kind of scientific about how you're managing this and really give yourself that agronomic and economic benefit of those nutrients.
So if we're talking about beef manure, just to kind of solidify that, with our numbers at about $18 a ton, you're talking 2.5 tons of proper placement to pay for a soil test and a manure sample, right? That is not very much beef manure in the whole grand scheme of applying nutrients, right? If you're talking about turkey or broiler litter, that's like a half a ton to be able to offset these prices. And we have the similar conversation with lime, right? At $75 a ton spread, it takes almost no lime to offset a $10 soil test. Um,
Right.
with this information, like it almost becomes kind of a why are we not doing this every 3 years? Why are we not sampling manure? And why are we not kind of focusing in on this with the price of inputs?
You know, here we are in the fall of in early winter of 2024. The weather has been so nice for manure application and crop harvest. A lot of people probably are ahead compared to other years. So maybe spend your winter manure time getting your soil samples into the lab and your manure analysis into the lab, and then start planning for next spring and what you're going to do through your whole manure year, through next winter, through next fall and winter, and start looking ahead at that.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I was just out driving yesterday and I noticed a whole bunch of manure being put down on the fields just this morning. I got behind a hog manure truck. And so I agree. I think we're going to be way ahead as compared to previous years. So it'll be interesting to see how many of those farms actually have to do any winter applications this year. Now, granted, we can't predict the weather and we have no idea what it's going to do turn of next year, but we'll see.
Before we jump into the final thoughts, we want to ask you all what you think about any of this or any conclusions. But my next thing is we stopped this February 28th, right? That is our deadline of winter manure spreading. Are there other seasons that we have to consider with this? So for frame of reference, if we're thinking about I'm doing what I'm supposed to do, I'm limiting my winter manure, but my pit or my barn is starting to fill up, do I have any other considerations that I need to think about come March 1st when we change from winter to spring manure, or is it just get it out there as best you can then at that point?
Well, first off, after on March 1st, it could still be winter if it's frozen or snow covered. So the winter conditions can still pertain to how you apply manure. But if it's not frozen and there's no snow and it's March 1, then you can revert right to your spring application season and the rates that and setbacks that you have in the plan for that. But you want to be careful. If soils are saturated, right? You want to avoid compaction. You want to avoid driving on them. Manure can be heavy, and our loads can cause compaction. You also want to think about that saturation or runoff potential as a risk. If we want to place manure nutrients that are going to stay in the field until we can utilize them, then getting on wet soil just because you want to get out there and get the work done sometimes can backfire on you, and those nutrients are at risk of being gone, and you lose that economic value of those, and that's not benefiting anybody. So you need to be careful about that. And also, you want to watch the weather, right? We always have joked about how weathermen are never getting it right, but in today's world, I have two weather apps on my phone, and both of them are pretty dang reliable. And we get better and better with weather prediction. And if you see something coming, and there's risk coming, and your manure nutrients are going to wash away, then why put them out there, right? You're just throwing good money away if you do that, and that's not a very good management decision at times.
I feel like that's the key there, is as we get into our spring here, especially if we had snow and it's melting, we have very saturated soils, and then we might start having all of those spring rains come on top of that. So just keeping that in mind, that we could just wash all of that completely away.
So it sounds like there are a lot of things to consider, right? If we have saturated soils, that can be a bad time. I can also imagine if it's really dry out, but we know there's a heavy rain coming, that might not be the best time either because you have a lot of run potential there. So can you maybe walk us through what's the ideal time, all things being equal, to spread manure? Maybe that's an impossible question, but what's the ideal time, if you can, to do it?
I feel like that's a loaded question of like there's never these perfect scenarios, but I mean, it would be one of those situations where we have soils that are saturated is not the word that I'm going for, but like their moisture is there. They're not saturated though. And so when you put the manure down, the nutrients will go in, and then we're going to be getting a light rain after that. So that quarter to half an inch of a steady rain, not like that quick thunderstorm pounding rain that's going to wash everything off. So like, yeah, that would be like perfect scenario. It's not too sunny either when you're applying the manure so that you're not losing any of that nitrogen. But yeah.
We'll order a couple of weeks of that in the spring for
Yeah.
you. It's always a good idea to time your manure application close to the crop uptake time, right? So the closer you can get it to when the crop is going to uptake it, the nutrients, the better off. And primarily the benefit there is with nitrogen, because the longer the nitrogen sits on the field, the more that will volatilize and leave the field in the form of ammonia into the atmosphere. And that's a loss that you can hedge against if you put your timing close to crop uptake.
Okay, there we go. So if we can time it for a time where we have a lot of crop uptake, We have some moist soils. I guess moist, maybe, I don't know if that's the right word, but whatever the word is. And then some steady light rains, cloudy skies. There we go. We'll wait for that day, and that's when we'll do it.
Hey, good soil health helps infiltration, right?
Yep.
Right.
A nutrient on the very surface of the soil doesn't do very good because the roots aren't popping up there and grabbing it and sucking it down. So you need to get the nutrient to get into the soil. So infiltration and soil health become very important. Crusting of soil can occur, right? If you have winter rains and bare soil, you can get that soil surface that is crusted. It doesn't want to allow infiltration. So anything you can do to propagate long-term soil health does help infiltration, and that's always a good thing.
Great. Okay. Yep. That makes a lot of sense. I think that Justin, do you have any other questions here? Is there any other thoughts that you guys have before we close it out?
So if I was sitting here thinking about what you all were saying, and if someone called, and tell me if this is a fair statement or not, if someone called and said, what day or what's the perfect condition to go apply moisture, or excuse me, manure, could this be something we say like, well, if you think you're 2 days away from planting weather, that would be good manure spreading weather, right? Like that's a kind of an anecdotal thing of if you say, well, we're not quite ready to plant yet, but we might be tomorrow. From there all the way to planting type weather and soil conditions, is that a fair assessment on when it's okay to put out manure, or is that too strict?
That's a tough question. It sounds reasonable.
I would agree. I know. I don't feel like I had much more to add.
Yeah, I mean, it's just one of those things, right? We can nail down like when to cut hay, when to plant, when to do this, but it's just interesting that we just, I don't know, do it. You know, if it's not frozen, if it's not snow covered, if it's not steep, just go put it out. But we don't have these like real technical boundaries exactly of like when we see the best stuff. So that it was just curiosity more than
Well,
anything.
and I feel like that's where Rob's comment from earlier kind of comes in, is he was talking about the folks that handle manure on a regular basis, and they're really paying attention to where they're going, where they're applying, and all that good stuff. And I think where we might see that happening a lot less is those folks that they're cleaning out their barn full of beef cows once, twice a year, spreading manure because they're cleaning it out. It needs to go on. And so, yeah, I think that's where we see those differences, is how often, how regularly you're handling that manure. And yeah.
Yeah, so the window of opportunity might be operationally dependent, right?
Yeah.
Upon how is your manure handling system put together, from where it's deposited inside to how you handle it, and if you have a stacking area or not, right? There's a lot that goes into that we can talk about all these perfect world scenarios, but whenever you get into the real world, we appreciate that every farm has its own protocol and standard operating procedure that they have to, because their situations are a little different.
Keeps life interesting. Job security for Rob.
So just another episode we can summarize an extension with "It depends."
Yeah, right.
That sounds about right.
No, I think I'm good. Just do you all have any final thoughts to leave us on?
If you want help writing a manure management plan or developing any of this, or have questions, right? Extension at Penn State is available to you. Your county conservation district is available. There's lots of people who have, as part of their job description, the ability to help any farm develop a plan. So don't hesitate to reach out for help.
Well, I feel like I have to do it. Between our farm and other farms in the family, it's the running joke, because it's a crappy job, but somebody's got to do it.
I would say Justin, Ryan, Leanna, been great shooting the shit with you. Or should we say, Justin, Ryan, Leanna, it's been great shooting the bull with you.
Wow, we held off for mighty long in this episode without any crap jokes. So I'm glad we finally got around to it. So for any of the listeners that actually stuck around to the end, there's your little bonus content for you.
It was hard to hold back, let me tell you.
Oh, we could go on and on with those. All right, guys. Well, thank you very much for coming on, Leanna and Rob. It was a pleasure. I learned a lot about manure spreading. I didn't know much going in. Now I know a little bit. So I will spread the good word along to my farmers every time that I'm driving in nowadays and I'm smelling it in the air. I'll let them know what you guys have to say. So I appreciate you guys walking us through the do's and don'ts of winter manure spreading. And for our listeners, thank you for sticking with us. And we'll see you again for another episode of the Agronomy Highlights podcast.